In our today's lecture, we look at hunger and malnutrition. By hunger, we do not mean that empty feeling one gets before any mealtime. We mean the inability day after day to satisfy our basic nutrition needs. The hunger dieters feel from cutting calories. This deprivation is involuntary and unwanted. Technically speaking, malnutrition can be any kind of unhealthy nutritional status, including the result of imbalance and excess, obesity, or toxicity from oversupplementation. Obesity as an emerging issue. We touch on obesity because obesity it's an emerging issue nowadays, even in developing countries and developed countries. Along the spectrum of malnutrition and hunger is the less extreme condition of food insecurity. The ongoing worry about having enough to eat. At the opposite end of the spectrum is food security, which means access to nutritionally adequate and safe food. Most people in the industrialized world are food secure. Overabundance and obesity are the primary problem in these populations. But malnutrition is a very serious problem among certain groups such as homeless and urban poor. Worldwide, round about 925 million people do not have enough to eat. This figure includes 19 million in developed countries. Most of the world's hungry live in developing countries. Just focus on this point, 19 million out of 925 includes developed country, and most of the world's hungry live in developing countries out of the 925 million people. The most undernourished region is Asia and Pacific, round about 578 million people, and the region with the highest proportion of undernutrition is Africa, 30%, which is 239 million people. If we look from the worldwide perspective, we see that more than half the deaths of the children younger than 5 years is caused directly or indirectly by malnutrition. According to the World Health Organization, proper nutrition and health are fundamental human rights. Nutrition is a cornerstone that affects and defines the health of all individuals, rich and poor. It paves the way for us to grow, develop, work, play, resist infection, and aspire to realization of our fullest potential as individuals and societies. Malnutrition makes us all more vulnerable to diseases and premature death. Hunger is a global problem. The number and the proportion of undernourished people have declined, but they remain unacceptably very high. Undernourishment remains higher than before the food and economic crisis, making it ever more difficult to achieve international hunger targets. This is a statement from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The world food system is in trouble, and the hotspots of food risk will be high. Food prices combined with the shocks from weather or political crisis. These are all the recipes for disaster. I think you all know about World Health Organization. It's a global organization that directs and coordinates international health work. Its goal is the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health, defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And Food and Agriculture Organization works to alleviate the poverty and hunger by promoting the agriculture development, improved nutrition, and the pursuit of food security. Income growth, high energy prices, climate changes, globalization, and urbanization all are transforming food consumptions. Soaring food prices are hitting the world's most vulnerable, those who must spend a substantial part of their income on food. Today, the world consumes more than it produces, and the cost of the food has been rising steadily, reversing a downward trend of more than 4 decades. Food stocks are at a low, and the food supply is vulnerable to unpredictable factors such as adverse weather. During any disaster, food prices rise rapidly, while on other side, family incomes decline, producing an economic mismatch that is the root cause of most famines. These all are the causes which produces the economic crisis. Some developing countries are undergoing rapid economic expansion. People in emerging economics such as India, Brazil, and at least 10 African countries have become more prosperous and are changing their diets. Since 1990, I have given you some example. Since 1990, China has nearly doubled its consumption of meat, fish, and dairy product because it takes 7 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. This shift removes the grain from the global marketplace. In just the past few years, China has changed from being one of the largest corn exporters to becoming an importer of corns. Record oil prices have driven up costs along the entire food production chain, from fertilizer to diesel, for planting and harvesting to storage and shipping. High oil prices also make food stocks a more attractive alternative fuel. Production of biodiesel and other biofuels is pressuring the global market for wheat, corn, sugar, oil containing seeds, palm oil, and other crops. As a result of climate change, farmers will face growing unpredictability and variability in water supplies and increasing frequency of droughts and floods. Today, as you can see floods in our country due to the heavy rain. These impacts will vary tremendously from place to place. Livelihood of rural communities and the food security of urban population are at risk from water-related impacts linked to the climate variability. The rural poor, who are the most vulnerable to be disproportionately affected. Water is fundamental to the stability of global food production. Reliable access to water increases the agriculture yield, and the lack of sustainable water management places global food security at risk. Just focus on this point. Water is fundamental to the stability of the food production, and reliable water resources must be managed to increase the global food security. In developing countries, drought is the single most common natural cause of severe food shortage. Floods are another major causes of food emergencies. Climate changes increase the rainfalls and frequency of extreme weather. It will threaten the food security. Some international agencies and some government programs help to fight against the food shortages and hunger. Long-term solutions to hungers are tremendously complex. They require economic, political, and social changes, as well as improvement in nutrition, food production, and environmental safeguards. As you all study the critical nutrient deficiencies in the developing world, you will see that poverty, infection, poor sanitation, and social upheaval interact with the nutrient shortages to bring about these deficiencies. Poverty, overpopulation, and migration. Two overcrowded cities are closely interrelated causes of the hunger. Each situation worsens the effects of others as they steadily drive our population towards malnutrition. Poverty, hunger, and malnutrition stalk one another, compromising health and wreaking on the development of entire countries and regions. A large percentage of the global population, especially those in developing countries, bear this triple burden. Triple burden means poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. These three factors stalking one another in a circle. Poverty is the most important reason for chronic hunger. It limits access to food. Obviously, as you all know, hunger limits the poverty limits the access to food. It limits the purchase of farming supplies to grow the foods, boats and equipments to fishes, and storage equipments to prevent the food spoilage. It limits the access to medical care. It also compromises sanitation efforts. It discourages the education and the chances for personal advancements. Poverty means paralyzed economic development. It paralyzed your economic development and too few jobs, inadequate investment in infrastructures and basic housing, and too few resources to train doctors, nurses, nutritionists, and other healthcare workers. Population growth in many regions is gain in food production, education, employment, healthcare, and economic progress. The above numbers stress limited environmental resources, contributing to environmental degradation and population. In rural areas where farmland is limited, each small number of family land is subdivided with each generation until there is too little land to support each family. You may think that poverty would pressure parents to limit their family size. Poverty and sickness do just the reverse. Where child mortality rates are high, having many babies in a guarantee some children will survive. In countries that have no economic safeguard for disability, unemployment, or old age, parents consider their children a source of security and support in times of need. Many other factors contribute to large families, from ignorance of birth control methods to the attitude that big families reflect the father's masculinity. Some political groups also encourage the high birth rates and fast population growth as a way to achieve the political or military dominance. To slow population growth, socio-economic changes, and cultural changes that make the family smaller size acceptable, even desirable, must accompany access to birth control. Urbanization is another social and economic factor. Urbanization is a worldwide trend. As rural lands become too crowded or exhausted, farmland no longer supports good crops. Rural people migrate to the city in hope of jobs and better life. Unfortunately, in fast growing cities, social disorders, sanitary conditions, and living standards can be much worse. Hunting, fishing, and gardening, source of accessible food in the rural setting, are seldom an option in the city. Breastfeeding becomes impractical for many mothers who could nurse their babies while doing farm work but cannot do so with jobs in the cities. As you all know, infection interacts with malnutrition, each making its victim more vulnerable to the other, each making the other worse. Nutrient deficiencies lower the resistance to the infection. The fever of infection speeds depletion of calories and nutrients. Other symptoms such as loss of appetite, nausea, weakness, and mouth lions limit the ability to eat. Infectious diarrhea is especially dangerous, quickly wasting what few nutrients are consumed. Infants and young children can die quickly from loss of electrolytes. Programs that prevent or control the infection, such as immunization, improvements in hygiene and sanitation, safe water supplies, access to medicine and medical care, all indirectly improve the nutrition status. Infection with the HIV, which is human immunodeficiency virus, provides a dramatic demonstration of the interaction between malnutrition and infection. Among those who are afflicted, the infection progresses fastest in the people who are poorly nourished. Severe loss of weight and muscle is a hallmark of the advanced disease. Acquired immunity deficiency syndrome, which is AIDS. AIDS is the fourth leading cause of death globally. More than 33 million people are living with HIV because infected people are living longer than before, and AIDS-related deaths have declined in recent years. 97% of people living with HIV live in low and middle income countries, and an estimated 67% of all people living with HIV worldwide living in Africa, where it is the leading cause of death. Other areas experiencing the severe epidemics include Europe, America, and Central Asia. According to the 2009 figure, approximately 370 million children were newly infected with HIV, bringing the total number of children living with HIV to 2.1 million. About half of all the new adult HIV infections occur among 15 to 24 years old, and in 2010, 7.6 million children younger than the age of 5 died from AIDS. Social and natural disasters such as floods and droughts can leave famine in their wake. The resulting displacement of populations and inequitable food distribution usually lead to the hunger and malnutrition. War is very important political factor. Poverty is the cause of chronic mild to moderate malnutrition. War and its aftermath cause severe malnutrition and famine. War diverts limited financial resources from development efforts to expenditures for fighting and destruction. Men and women no longer farm, fish, or bring home a paycheck. They are in the army. Households become fatherless and sometimes motherless permanently. Crops and croplands are destroyed along with irrigation system, food processing facilities and transportation infrastructures, which may have taken the decades to develop. Masses of refugees, many very young, old, and already weakened by chronic hunger, find themselves without the basic element of substances. The resulting famine has become an all too common sight on the evening news. International agencies have learned to respond to these emergencies quickly and with great determination. But logistic difficulties such as mobilizing manpower, obtaining foods, transporting supplies, setting up the feeding stations can slow the relief until it is too late for the sickest or weakest individuals. Some refugee groups are inaccessible, hidden, or intentionally kept hungry as part of a political plan. Emergency food may never reach many of them. Sanctions are also very important political factor. International sanctions and embargoes create the food shortages, both directly and indirectly, by limiting access to agriculture supplies, fuel, and food processing supplies. Some people argue that shortages created by the sanctions hurt the powerless people rather than government officials. Others say that such actions are preferable to wars, flood, droughts, and hurricanes. Also, very important factor. These create the largest disruption. Many countries are not equipped to deal with food shortages, water and food sanitation concerns, and hunger caused by the disruptions in food supply and distribution resulting from natural disasters. International agencies and other governments step in to help when possible and where possible. Emergency relief efforts include food distribution have taken more of a prominent role in disaster preparedness in the wake of terrorist attacks such as natural disasters such as hurricanes. International agencies have reevaluated their levels of preparedness to respond to these type of emergencies. department through its Agency for International Development, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is FEMA, and the CDC, which is through the Center for Communicable Disease. These agencies offer both short-term emergency effort and long-term programs for repair and rebuilding. Advances in agriculture increase the food supplies and reduce the food costs. Because the economies of most developing countries are based on agriculture, improvements boost the rural incomes and buying power. Increased demand for agriculture labor stimulate the commerce among small vendors and food processors, and ultimately help a nation's economy. Dramatic gain in agriculture productivity took place in 1960s and 1970s with the development of new seed varieties, especially corn and rice. The seeds greatly increased crop yields. Expectations were so strong that these seeds would finally solve the world's food shortage, that their development and use was Green Revolution. Despite its success, the Green Revolution had limitations. The seeds required irrigation and heavy use of pesticides and fertilizers, which poor farmers could not afford. The farming techniques were sometimes hard on the environment. Proponents of agriculture biotechnology see it as another step along the continuum of plant breeding techniques and a promising tool to increase the crop production. Some use of biotechnology are well accepted, for example, such as diagnostic kits that identify the plant and insect by their DNA, and tissue culture for plant reproduction, a technique already in widespread commercial use. More controversial is the modification of plant genetic material. The technology has the potential to improve the plant's resistance to the disease, tolerance of adverse condition, and nutritional quality. At other end of technology is a renewed appreciation and conservation of tradition seed varieties, those selected over the generations by local farmers because they do well in local conditions. In developing countries, farmers typically save some of these seeds at each harvest to use in the next planting session. The seeds grow well in the regions where they have evolved, whereas imported seeds, no matter how carefully bred, often fail. In addition to the second selection, strategies to optimize the agriculture include irrigation, soil preparation, improved planting and harvest methods, erosion prevention, fertilization, flood control, and pest control. Methods should be affordable, suitable for the level of local development, and protective of the environment. Some example is giving you where there is an abundant supply of willing farm laborers and gasoline is expensive. Using the heavy duty farm machinery makes the little sense. Other examples such as mulching to conserve the water and control the weeds, and using the manure after composting to kill the pathogens to reduce the need for fertilizers. Environmental degradation is a growing concern in both developing countries and industrialized world. In developing countries, there is pressure for some land to support rapidly expanding populations. In industrialized countries, there is pressure from the affluent for more land, more houses, and larger properties, more recreation areas. Residents of the industrialized world consume vast amounts of resources such as water, wood, paper, fuel, textiles, and food, without a thought or making a small effort to conserve or recycle. Residents of the developing world consume much less per person, but the impact of their number is greater. Environmental degradation has nutritional consequences because it threatens the food production. Urbanization and the expansions of cities reduce available for farming. The pressure to supply the food to growing population leads to the clear-cutting marginal land, eventually quickly exhausting fragile rainforest soils. Over-dependence on irrigation can drain the water, creating the deserts. The destruction of vast areas of natural grounds over can lead to the global climate change. Overuse of the pesticides and fertilizers pollutes the waterways and destroying the fish and seafood. Despite gains in eradicating the malnutrition, almost all of the undernourished people in the world live in the developing countries. As you all know that malnourished person has two or more coexisting deficiencies, each increasing the severity of the other. The increasing prevalence of obesity worldwide has presented a new nutritional paradox. The growing number of overweight individuals who are malnourished with worsening the health status, increased disability, and higher risk of chronic degenerative condition presents a new global health problem. Lack of protein and also energy can have devastating outcomes, especially on the young children. In kwashiorkor, the body and face swell with excess fluid. The hair turns red and fragile, and a terrible rash develops on the skin. Without treatment, the person dies. Marasmus patients an even more dramatic picture of sunken eyes, limbs, and a clearly visible outline of the skeleton. It is as deadly as kwashiorkor. Protein energy malnutrition, most lethal form of malnutrition, and children are its most visible victims. Their rapid growth creates the high nutrients demands, leaving them especially vulnerable to inappropriate food distribution in the family, inappropriate infants, and child feeding practices. and interactions of the infection with malnutrition. Protein allergy malnutrition typically develops. A child is weaned from the breast. When the second baby is born, the first child is weaned from the breast. Men in the household many have a priority for nutritious food. In big families, the young child must also compete for food with many siblings. In the developing world, breastfeeding is almost always essential to an infant's survival. Inappropriate bottle feeding puts a baby at grave risk. Relative to income, formula is usually very expensive and is often diluted to make it stretch. Contaminated water and lack of other hygienic requirements for bottle preparations causes the diarrhea. The combination of diarrhea and nutritional deficiency from the watered down formula is very fatal. Tremendous educational efforts, including the promotion of breastfeeding, had reduced the global prevalence and severity of infant and childhood protein allergy malnutrition. Severe protein allergy malnutrition, typified by kwashiorkor or marasmus, has become more sporadic, occurring mainly as a result of war or natural disasters. Mild to moderate protein allergy malnutrition continues to pose a grave problem in the developing world, putting the children at risk of delayed growth, impaired psychological development, and the deadly interactions of disease and malnutrition. Iodine deficiency is the world's most common cause of preventable brain damage and one of the main causes of impaired cognitive development in children. Its impairment of intellectual ability and work performance is potentially so widespread that iodine deficiency disorders can actually slow our nation's social development and economic development. Iodine deficiency is most devastating during the pregnancy, causing the spontaneous abortion, stillbirths, and birth defects, including the cretinism, a disease of mental retardation that is often severe. Deafness and spastic paralysis are likely to accompany the retardation. Iodine deficiency is damaging at all ages, limiting the mental development in infants and children, and producing the apathy and marginal mental functions in adults. Iodine deficiency disorders are endemic throughout much of the developing world where the soil is low in iodine. These areas typically are mountainous or far from the oceans. They often are isolated and impoverished. Imported food is a potential source of iodine is not consumed. According to the World Health Organization reports, 54 countries are still iodine deficient, and 31.5%, which is 266 million of school-aged children have the insufficient iodine intake. Distributing through these figures, great strides have been made. in prevention, mainly through the iodizing salt. More than two-thirds of households now use the iodized salt, and over the past decades, the number of countries where the iodine deficiency is a public health problem. In countries with the salt iodization programs in place for 5 years or more, the improvements in iodine status has been dramatic. The cost is merely 5 cents per person per year. Deficiency of vitamin A is the leading cause of preventable blindness in children. It also increases the risk of disease and death from severe infections. Vitamin A deficiency causes the night blindness and in pregnant women can increase the risk of maternal mortality. Vitamin A deficiency is a public health problem in more than half of all countries, especially those in Africa and Asia, hitting young children and pregnant women in low-income countries hardest. The nutrient is crucial for maternal and child survival and supply the adequate vitamin A in high risk areas can significantly reduce the mortality. Its absence cause a need high risk of disease and death. Estimately 250 million preschool children are vitamin A deficit. Vitamin A deficiency coexists with the marginal protein energy malnutrition. The vitamin deficiency predisposes the infants and children to diarrheal disease, which in turn worsen the child's nutritional status, leading to severe protein energy malnutrition. Common child infections such as measles are much more serious in vitamin A deficient children, with a much greater risk of death or permanent damage from the complications. In communities where the vitamin A deficiency exists, pregnant and the breastfeeding women experience the night blindness and early symptoms of deficiency, maternal death, poor pregnancy outcomes, and failure to the lactate are all increased with the vitamin A deficiency. Vitamin A levels in the breast milk of these women are likely to be low as putting their infants at risk of deficiency. Many countries are taking a multi-pronged approach to vitamin A deficiency that includes the promotion of breastfeeding, fortification of foods, supplementation and nutrition education. Foods such as eggs, dairy foods and liver are promoted as important for women and child. Education programs also encourages the growing and eating fruits and vegetables which are high in beta carotenes. Dietary changes can be very difficult and slow. The best sources of vitamin A to vitamin A is beta carotene. Requires dietary fats and other expensive item in the many areas. Biotechnology can have a significant impact on vitamin A deficiency through the genetic engineering. Scientists have developed a strain of rice that is rich in beta carotene. When these rice plants are crossed with the locally grown strains of rice, they become suited to a particular region's climate and growing conditions. If local farmers and consumers accept such crops, bioengineered rice may play a critical role in feeding the world's population and alleviating the widespread vitamin A deficiency. Iron deficiency is also the most common nutritional problem in the world. The numbers are astonishing. 2 billion people, more than 30% of the world's population, are anemic because of iron deficiency. In resource poor areas, the condition frequently is worsened by the infectious diseases such as malaria, HIV, and hookworm infestation. Iron deficiency occurs in all age groups. Fast growth in young children and reproductive blood loss in women make them especially vulnerable to the low iron diets. Anemia impairs the childhood development, work capacity, learning capacity, and resistance to the diseases. Anemia during the pregnancy increases the illness and death rates for mother and baby. For all groups of people, anemia can cause the profound fatigue, and severe anemia cause the death. The anemias of the developing world demonstrate the interactions of multiple nutrient deficiencies, which interact with the infection, sanitation, and poverty. Supplying the iron alone is enough to correct the problem. Iron deficient diets are high in the starches and cereal grains. During the digestion, cereals can bind with the very limited iron the diet provides, preventing its absorption. Other blood building nutrients such as vitamin B6, vitamin B12, and folate are often in short supply as well. Anemia producing the parasites are common in areas of iron deficiency, aggravating the effects of poor diets. Blood cells are destroying by malarial infection. Intestinal malabsorption and intestinal bleeding are caused by the hookworm, where human waste contaminates the fields where people walk barefoot, and by other parasites acquired when human waste contaminates the water that people drink or in which people bathe. People debilitated by anemia can be too weak to build the outhouses, too poor to buy the shoes or fuel to boil the water. Timely treatment can restore the personal health and raise the national productivity levels by as much as 20%. Increase your iron intake. Dietary diversification, including the iron-rich foods and enhancement of iron absorption, food fortification, and iron supplements. Always control your infection, immunization, and control programs for malaria and parasitic worm diseases. Improve your nutritional status. Prevention and control of other nutritional deficiencies such as vitamin B12, folate, and vitamin A. Obesity is a growing health problem worldwide and is increasingly being recognized as a form of malnutrition. Obesity has reached epidemic proportions globally, with more than 1 billion adults overweight, at least 300 million of them clinically obese. It is a major contributor to the global burden of chronic disease and disability. In developed countries, obesity often exists right alongside the undernutrition. Obesity is more likely in the areas of the economic advancements and in urban areas. Its prevalence is rising rapidly in Africa, Asia, and America. Societal changes and the worldwide nutrition transition are driving the obesity epidemic. Economic growth, modernization, urbanization, and globalization of food in markets are some of the forces thought to underlie the epidemic. As income rise and population become more urban, diets high in complex carbohydrates give way to the more varied diets with a higher proportion of fats, saturated fats, and sugars. Calorie dense foods that have few other nutrients are often cheap, satisfying, convenient, and heavily promoted. Some are foreign brands that have become affordable status symbol. In poor communities, cultural attitudes toward the overweight may be more accepting and even the admiring. Large shifts towards the less physical demanding work have been observed worldwide. Moves toward the less physical activity are also found in the increasing use of automated transport, technology in the home, and more passive leisure pursuits. The reductions in the energy expenditure can be dramatic. If an individual is overweight, can we assume that person is well nourished? Individual is overweight, can we assume that the person is well nourished? Not necessarily. A new trend in developed countries is the presence of malnutrition with the obesity. With too little physical activity, obese individual can be eating too much calories of poor nutrient foods and not enough nutritious food including the vegetables and fruits. The availability of an overabundance of the inexpensive food choices in combinations with the lack of the accessible opportunities for the physical activities are just some of the factors contributing to the obesogenic environment in which many people are currently living. Obesity and overnutrition also increasing in the developing countries and become a public health problem in developing countries nowadays. Deficiencies of zinc and calcium coexist with other deficiencies, contributing to illness and death during the periods of growth and threatening immune functions and skeletal health in people who survive to old age. Selenium deficiency, limited to only a few countries, has serious consequences. It occurs where the soil is selenium poor. The deficiency is most severe. It predisposes the individuals to the fatal Cachon disease, in which your heart muscles is destroyed. Cachon disease affects mainly women and children. The condition can be prevented by the selenium supplementation or by the fortification. The classical deficiency diseases beriberi, pellagra, and scurvy still occur among the world's poorest and most underprivileged people. These diseases strike the victims of war and political strife, the refugees. Diet based on mild cereals, and starchy fruits, all poor thiamine sources, predispose refugee populations to beriberi. People who rely on corn-based diets, low in niacin and tryptophan, are susceptible to the plague. The disruption of refugee life can easily tip the balance from marginal deficiencies to overt deficiency diseases. These all are the diseases of underprivileged and developing countries.